One of the biggest misconceptions about the law of polarity is thinking it's just about opposites. Hot versus cold, happy versus sad, success versus failure. I used to think that too. I thought it was just a clever way to explain contrast in life. But when I started really digging into it, into what the Kybalion and the ancient Hermetic texts actually said, I was shocked. I didn't realize this principle had been taught thousands of years ago. In a way so precise, so intelligent, it completely changed how I see reality. Honestly, it made me feel small and humbled, standing before the depth of Thoth's wisdom. So in this video, I want to take you past the surface. We're going to unpack what the law of polarity really means, not just as a theory, but as a tool you can apply immediately to every part of your life, to lift yourself out of career failures, heartbreak, negative energy, even that deep creative emptiness. Seriously, this is no joke. If you stay with me until the end, I'll share a simple but powerful practice you can apply right away, something that helps you shift your emotional state, navigate stress, and find clarity in moments of chaos. And if this kind of knowledge resonates with you, if you're curious about the deeper teachings of Thoth and Hermetic wisdom, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next parts in this series. Alright, let's dive in. The law of polarity is one of the core Hermetic principles laid out in the Kybalion, a book published in 1908 that summarizes ancient teachings, believed to have originated in Egypt and Greece. According to the Kybalion, everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pair of opposites. But this statement isn't just saying that opposites exist. It's saying that opposites are actually the same thing, just at different degrees. Think about temperature. Hot and cold aren't separate entities. They're just extremes of the same energy we call heat. The difference between them is a matter of degree, not a different substance. And this principle doesn't just apply to physical things like temperature or sound. It applies to your emotions, your thoughts, your behaviors, and even the circumstances you find yourself in. This matters because it means that no matter what state you're in, whether it's anger, fear, depression, or even failure, you're not stuck there. You're simply at one end of a spectrum. And once you realize that, you can start to move toward the other end. You can shift from fear to courage, from frustration to patience, from stagnation to growth. The law of polarity tells us that this shift is not just possible, it's natural. In fact, the movement between poles is how growth happens. We aren't meant to stay stuck at one end. Most people, especially in our modern Western mindset, are trained to think in black and white. We love categories. We say things are either good or bad, right or wrong, success or failure. But that way of seeing the world is incredibly limiting. It puts us at the mercy of our circumstances. If something bad happens, we collapse because we see no middle ground. But once we understand polarity, we stop reacting to life as if we're trapped in a game of win or lose. Instead, we begin to see the sliding scale and we learn how to move within it. This isn't just philosophy. You can see it in neuroscience and psychology. Our emotional states exist on continuums. Anxiety and excitement, for instance, activate the same physiological responses. Elevated heart rate, heightened alertness, shallow breathing, but are interpreted differently based on our perception. When we understand that emotional extremes are two poles of the same energy, we can start training our minds to shift our experience by shifting our perspective. I've seen this in my own life, especially during periods of burnout and stress. At one point, I found myself stuck in a cycle of overwork, frustration, and detachment. I assumed I was just burned out. But when I started applying this principle, I realized I was still connected to the energy of purpose. I had just slid down to the negative end of the scale. The solution wasn't to quit or escape. It was to realign, to move gradually toward inspiration again. That simple shift in understanding changed everything. So when we talk about polarity, we're not talking about being positive or negative people. We're talking about developing the awareness that life is fluid and that we can influence which direction we're heading. And for men in particular, especially those in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, dealing with the pressures of leadership, family, identity, and legacy. This is not just interesting theory. This practical power. The law of polarity reminds us that we don't need to fight our emotions or fear the dark times. We just need to recognize where we are on the scale and begin to move with intention. When you begin to apply this, you stop reacting to life like it's out of your control. You stop labeling yourself based on temporary experiences. And that's when real transformation starts. Not because you suddenly become someone else, but because you finally understand the deeper rhythm of how life actually works. When we hear about the law of polarity, it might seem like a modern idea, something that came out of self-help books or spiritual YouTube channels. But in truth, this principle is ancient. Long before it was written down in the Kybalion, the idea of duality and polar forces appeared across many of the world's oldest spiritual and philosophical systems. From Taoism in the East to Hermeticism in the West, ancient thinkers intuitively recognized that life is built on the dance of opposites. In ancient Egypt, where Hermeticism is said to have its roots, the gods themselves were often shown in polar pairs. Isis and Osiris, for instance, embodied feminine and masculine energies. Life and death, chaos and order, creation and destruction. These weren't seen as good versus evil, but as complementary dynamics in the dance of existence. Egyptian cosmology revolved around Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order, which could only exist through the balancing of opposites. Greek philosophers later built on this. Heraclitus, writing around 500 BCE, said, "The way up and the way down are one and the same." He believed that conflict between opposites was not a problem but the engine of all change. Plato and the Stoics also acknowledged the interplay between contrasting principles, but it was later thinkers like Plotinus and the Neoplatonists, who were influenced by Hermetic and Gnostic streams, who more clearly articulated this polarity as a spiritual structure of reality. Across the world, similar insights appeared. In Taoist philosophy from China, the principle of yin and yang stands as one of the clearest expressions of polarity. Yin and yang are not in conflict. They are two aspects of the same unified force, constantly flowing into one another. Day becomes night, night becomes day. Stillness turns into movement, and movement into stillness. There's no villain here, no side to pick. Harmony lies in their balance. In Tantric Hinduism, the same core idea shows up through the interplay of Shiva and Shakti. Shiva represents consciousness, the unmoving, passive field of awareness. Shakti is energy, dynamic, creative, active. They are not enemies. In fact, neither can exist without the other. The world exists because of their union. Spiritual realization in Tantra comes from unifying these polar energies within one's own being, not eliminating or denying one side. Even in Christian theology, though often interpreted through a lens of strict dualism, we find hints of deeper polarity. God is both justice and mercy. The Holy Spirit is both comforter and fire. In the Old Testament, God is seen both as creator and destroyer, giving life and taking it away. The wrathful and the loving aspects of the divine may seem contradictory, but they reflect two poles of divine expression, polarity misunderstood as moral conflict. This brings us to an important distinction: dualism versus polarity. Dualism sees opposites as separate and incompatible. In a dualistic worldview, there's good and there's evil, heaven and hell, spirit and matter. One is right, the other wrong. And this division creates a constant inner war between what we are and what we should be, between what we feel and what we're allowed to feel. Polarity, on the other hand, sees opposites as interconnected and interdependent. There is no pure good or pure evil, only degrees, spectrums, relationships. Hot and cold aren't different substances. They're different expressions of heat. Similarly, confidence and fear, peace and conflict, life and death, all exist on sliding scales. They need each other to exist. And the space between them is where transformation happens. This is where Hermeticism stands out. It doesn't shame one side of the polarity and glorify the other. It tells us, Both are necessary. Both are sacred. And the goal is not to eliminate the dark, but to understand its role in revealing the light. To stop swinging unconsciously between extremes and begin to navigate the spectrum with awareness. From a spiritual perspective, this is revolutionary. It means even God, however you define that, is not confined to a single side. The divine includes both creative and destructive forces. Just as forests grow through cycles of life and fire, the universe unfolds through a rhythm of becoming and dissolving. The same source that gives you joy may also guide you through pain, not as punishment but as recalibration. Carl Jung, one of the most influential thinkers in modern psychology, echoed this in his work. He believed that the human psyche contains many dual aspects, conscious and unconscious, persona and shadow, masculine and feminine, and that healing comes not from choosing one side, but from integrating both. To him, personal growth was about wholeness, not perfection. The more we deny one side of ourselves, the more it controls us from the shadows. But when we see ourselves clearly, when we acknowledge both poles, we begin to live more freely. This principle also shows up in Eastern martial arts and even military strategy. In Aikido, you don't resist the force of your opponent. You blend with it, redirect it, use its energy to neutralize conflict. This is polarity in action, working with the flow between opposites rather than getting stuck in the clash. The ancient Chinese general Sun Tzu said, "In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity." He wasn't being poetic, he was describing the mechanics of polarity. And when we zoom out from all these traditions and philosophies, what we find is this. Polarity is not a belief system, it's a pattern, a structure woven into the way reality operates. It shows up in religion, in science, in psychology, in your relationships, and in your internal emotional life. And once you recognize that pattern, you no longer feel like life is happening to you. You start to realize that you're part of a dynamic system, and that you have the power to influence where you stand within it. We're not talking about picking a side in a cosmic battle. We're talking about becoming aware of the spectrum you're on anytime, anywhere, and learning to navigate it with skill. That's what the ancient teachers meant. That's what the law of polarity really points to, not opposition but relationship, not judgment but movement, and in that there is enormous freedom. When we move beyond philosophy and look at the world through the lens of science, something fascinating happens. The law of polarity doesn't disappear. It actually becomes even more relevant. In fact, at the most fundamental level, down to the structure of atoms, the behavior of energy, and even the way your body keeps you alive, this principle is everywhere. Polarity isn't just a mystical idea from old books. It's baked into the code of reality. Let's start at the subatomic level. In quantum physics, every particle has a kind of partner. Electrons have a negative charge. Protons have a positive one. Neutrons are neutral, but even they have magnetic moments, tiny energetic spins. These opposite charges create attraction and repulsion, the basic forces that hold atoms together. The electromagnetic force, one of the four fundamental forces of nature, is entirely dependent on this polarity of charge. Without it, there would be no structure, no chemistry, no matter nothing. It goes even deeper. Quantum spin, a property of subatomic particles, is also a form of polarity. A particle's spin isn't a literal rotation, but rather a directional quality, up or down, clockwise or counterclockwise. These spins help define the behavior of particles in quantum fields, and the way they interact with others. It's polarity, once again, shaping the fabric of existence, not just in theory, but in what we observe at the quantum level. Now, shift that lens up from particles to people. Your body is a complex energy system. One of the clearest examples of polarity in your biology is the autonomic nervous system. This system runs automatically, regulating your heartbeat, breathing, digestion, and more. It's divided into two parts: the sympathetic nervous system, which revs you up for action, stress, danger, your fight or flight mode, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which calms you down, heals you, helps you rest and digest. These systems are polar in nature, not enemies, but complementary forces designed to keep you alive and balanced. When you're stressed out, overwhelmed, always on the go, stuck in constant action, you're living on one extreme of that polarity. If you stay there too long, your health breaks down. On the flip side, too much stillness, passivity, or detachment can lead to depression or stagnation. The body wants balance. And what does it take to restore that balance? You guessed it, recognition of polarity, and a conscious effort to move toward the other end when needed. Ancient systems of energy medicine understood this long before modern science could measure it. In yogic science, the body's energy system is said to flow through nadis, or subtle channels. Two of these channels, Ida and Pingala, represent the left and right energy currents in the body. Ida is associated with cooling, lunar, feminine energy, while Pingala is linked to heating, solar, masculine energy. These currents spiral around a central channel called Sushumna, which runs along the spine and represents the path of awakening. When the Ida and Pingala are in balance, energy begins to flow through the Sushumna. This is the spiritual equivalent of balance between parasympathetic and sympathetic systems. It's not just about physical calm. It's about energetic alignment, mental clarity, and even states of higher consciousness. Yogis say that when these polar currents are harmonized, the individual begins to transcend duality and enter a state of inner unity, a direct parallel to the law of polarity as described in the Kybalion. Here's the big takeaway. The natural world, including your own body, isn't fighting itself. It's structured around polarity. Poles exist not to create opposition, but to maintain flow, movement, and transformation. The problem doesn't lie in the poles themselves. It lies in how we perceive them. We label one side good and the other bad. We chase pleasure and avoid pain. We glorify strength and reject vulnerability. In doing so, we break the flow. We get stuck at one end, and life becomes rigid, reactive, and out of sync. This is why practices like meditation, breath work, and mindful movement are so powerful. They're not just stress relief, they're methods of polarity balancing. When you sit in stillness and observe your inner world, you're not choosing sides. You're not suppressing thought or emotion. You're witnessing both poles, the chaos and the calm, and creating space for them to realign. The breath itself becomes a symbol of this dance. Inhale and exhale, expansion and contraction, action and rest. Each breath is polarity in motion. I've seen this play out firsthand in high-performance professionals, executives, military veterans, entrepreneurs, men who live at the edge of action for years without pause. Once they begin practicing even 10 minutes of breath-centered meditation, they're not becoming soft or passive. They're restoring the other pole. And ironically, it makes them sharper, stronger, more grounded. It reboots the whole system. So whether you're looking at atoms, brains, or energy channels, the message is consistent. Polarity is natural, necessary, and deeply intelligent. It's not a flaw in the system, it is the system. And when we stop seeing the poles as enemies, and start understanding them as partners in a larger process, we tap into something that's not just spiritual, it's scientific. Balance isn't a luxury, it's a law, and we ignore it at our own risk. The Kybalion says, the art of polarization consists in changing the degree of feeling. It sounds simple, but behind that one sentence lies an entire map for mastering your inner world. According to Hermetic teachings, every emotional or mental state exists on a spectrum. Love and hate, confidence and fear, motivation and apathy, these aren't separate things. They're different intensities of the same energy, just as hot and cold are different expressions of temperature. This means we're never stuck where we are. We always have the potential to shift. That shift is what Hermeticists call mental transmutation, the ability to move from one pole of a mental or emotional state to its opposite, by consciously changing its degree. In modern terms, we might call it emotional self-regulation or reframing. But Hermeticism goes deeper. It doesn't just focus on changing thoughts. It emphasizes changing the vibration behind them. It's not about pretending to feel better. It's about moving your internal state across the spectrum of polarity through conscious awareness and will. So how does this actually work? The first step is recognition. When you're overwhelmed by a strong emotion, anger, anxiety, frustration, your instinct might be to either suppress it or act on it. Neither helps. What the Kybalion teaches instead is this: pause, observe, and understand where you are on the scale. Are you at the far negative pole of a particular energy? Then realize this isn't who you are. It's just where you are right now. From there, the second step is internal observation without judgment. This is where ancient wisdom meets modern psychology. Mindfulness, a core tool in cognitive behavioral therapy, tells us to create space between a stimulus and our reaction. That space is where freedom lives. In Hermetic terms, it's where you access the ability to transmute. You're not trying to eliminate the bad emotion because you can't. The principle of polarity tells us both poles will always exist. What you can do is shift your position within that energy field. Think of it like being on a dial. Say you're on the anger channel, volume up to 9. You're not going to flip that instantly into peace. But maybe you can turn the dial down to a 6. Maybe from there you slide into irritation. Then from irritation into neutrality. Then, if you keep going, into understanding or even compassion. The shift is gradual, and that's okay. The power is in the movement. This process can be summarized in 3 steps. Pause, observe, redirect. Pause your immediate reaction. That moment of stillness interrupts the cycle. Observe what you're feeling and name it honestly. Don't fight it, just acknowledge it. Redirect your energy, not by suppressing emotion, but by choosing a slightly different focus. Could be as simple as taking a breath, stepping outside, or reminding yourself, this is a state, I can move through it. The logic is clear. You can't delete the negative pole, but you can change your relationship to it. You can't remove cold from the world, but you can turn up the heat. In the same way, you can't permanently erase fear, but you can cultivate courage, which exists on the same emotional line. When we stop trying to resist what we feel, and instead engage with it intelligently, we stop being a slave to our moods. We become participants in our own transformation. I once worked with a client, a successful business owner, who came to me burnt out, irritable, and emotionally closed off. His instinct was to push through, but the more he pushed, the more the anger took over. When I introduced him to this idea of emotional polarity, something clicked. Instead of labeling his frustration as bad, we looked at it as energy trapped at a negative pole. Through simple breathwork, journaling, and inner inquiry, he started shifting. Not instantly, but consistently. Within weeks, his relationships improved. His leadership became more composed. He wasn't fixed. He was just operating from the other side of the same energy. This is the hidden genius of polarity. It removes the shame. You don't need to beat yourself up for feeling low. You just need to recognize the position you're in, and then begin to shift it, one small choice at a time. And if you practice this often enough, it becomes a skill, eventually a superpower. The law of polarity reminds us that we are never truly stuck. We may be deep in the shadows, but that shadow is part of the same spectrum as the light. The moment we stop resisting and start redirecting, the shift begins. Not by force, but by understanding the rules of the game. And if you can master that internal movement, if you can learn to transmute your own mental and emotional states, you've already begun to master your life. By now, you've probably got a firm grasp on the law of polarity. You understand that everything exists on a spectrum, that opposites are just different degrees of the same essence, and that transformation begins when you stop resisting and start shifting. But theory only gets us so far. The real change happens when you start to live this understanding, when you train yourself to see the world through this lens moment to moment. So let's bring this down to earth. Let's look at how polarity plays out in love, work, health, and creativity, for areas that most of us wrestle with on a daily basis. And let's go one step further. I'll show you how to spot polarity in action and how to use it to move from reaction to mastery. Love and relationships. From jealousy to deep connection. Jealousy and infatuation. On the surface, they look like opposites. One burns with fear, the other with longing. But both stem from the same core emotional energy, desire for closeness. When you feel jealous, you're not disconnected. You're overconnected to an idea of control, security, or ownership. When you're infatuated, you're idealizing someone, elevating them to the extreme pole of your emotional spectrum. The trick isn't to suppress either one. It's to recognize what part of the spectrum you're on and move toward the center. Ask yourself, what am I afraid of losing? What am I grasping for? Then bring the focus back to connection without clinging. This might mean stepping back and reconnecting with yourself, or having a vulnerable conversation where you name your fear without blaming your partner. Practice. When a strong emotional wave hits you in a relationship, whether it's jealousy, craving, or anger, pause and say out loud, or in your head, this is energy. Where am I on the spectrum right now? That one question breaks the loop and invites awareness. Work and ambition. From failure to growth. In the world of achievement, we're constantly taught to chase success and fear failure. But if you look at your own career, truly look, you'll see that most breakthroughs come through failure. Setbacks often push you to refine, redirect, or reinvent. In Hermetic terms, failure and success are not different realities. They are two poles of the same learning curve. When a deal falls through or a project doesn't land, instead of labeling it as bad, try asking, where am I on the learning spectrum? What's the movement available to me here? The mistake isn't in failing, it's in stopping there. Practice. At the end of each workday, ask yourself, what polarity did I move through today? Did you go from clarity to confusion and back again? From motivation to frustration and then to insight? Tracking these shifts turns your day into a learning system, not a judgment system. Health and vitality. From overdrive to healing. Your body is a living polarity system. As we covered earlier, your nervous system is constantly swinging between sympathetic, action, and parasympathetic, rest, states. The problem arises when you get stuck on one end, either in constant stress or in total lethargy. Healing isn't found in forcing more energy or shutting everything down. It's found in learning to rebalance the system. Let's say you've been feeling exhausted. Rather than pushing through with caffeine or collapsing in defeat, start by asking, am I stuck at one end of my energy polarity? Maybe you've been in fight or flight mode for weeks. What would it mean to consciously move towards stillness? Not as withdrawal, but as nourishment. Practice. Use your breath as a polarity tool. Inhale to activate, sympathetic. Exhale to relax, parasympathetic. Try a 4-4-6-2 breathing pattern. Inhale 4, hold 4, exhale 6, hold 2. This simple rhythm shifts your nervous system toward balance. Creativity. From emptiness to expression. Here's a secret all creatives know. Your best work often comes not in moments of euphoria, but from the depths. That blank page, that empty feeling, that's not the opposite of creativity. It's the beginning of it. The emptiness is a pole. On the other side is expression, but the two are linked. Instead of resisting the low moments, embrace them. Let them be part of the cycle. If you feel uninspired, rather than trying to force an idea, simply sit with the lack of energy as a necessary phase of polarity. Creativity often blooms when you stop fighting the stillness. Practice. Keep a polarity journal for your creative cycles. Write down your high days and your empty days. After a few weeks, you'll see a rhythm. Once you understand that rhythm, you stop fearing the dips and start using them as fuel. The daily shift. Noticing polarity as a practice. If there's one takeaway here, it's this. Polarity isn't just a spiritual or mental framework. It's a lens for daily life. Every time you feel an emotional charge, a craving, a resistance, stop and ask, what's the opposite pole? Can I shift, even just a little, towards center? You'll be amazed at how quickly your perception changes. What used to feel like problems become patterns. What used to feel like resistance becomes raw material. That's the deeper lesson here. Life isn't against you. It's just offering you both ends of a polarity, asking, what are you going to do with this energy? And the more you practice, the less reactive you become. Instead of swinging back and forth between extremes, you start to live from a centered place. You move not from fear or craving, but from clarity. That's when real power emerges. Not the power of control, but the power of internal alignment. At this point, you've journeyed deep into the true meaning of the law of polarity. And now it's time to bring it home. At its core, this principle isn't just about opposites. It's about evolution. It's about becoming the kind of person who no longer reacts blindly to extremes, but who learns to observe, to transmute, and to create. To live beyond polarity doesn't mean eliminating opposites. It means no longer being ruled by them. It means seeing clearly, choosing consciously, and aligning with a deeper intelligence that lives beneath the swing of emotions, judgments, and roles. It begins with understanding, deepens through observation, activates through transformation, leads to integration, and ultimately brings you into a space of freedom. This is the essence of polarity. Understand, observe, transmute, integrate freedom. The Kybalion says it best. He who understands the principle of polarity has grasped the key to mastering mental states. And that's what this journey is really about. Not just knowing, but mastering. Not just reacting, but choosing. Not just surviving, but creating. So here's your invitation. Don't just listen. Live this law. Start from the inside. Watch your reactions. Catch the extremes. Practice shifting even slightly toward center. Every day gives you a dozen opportunities to do this. Use them. Let the law become your compass. And if this journey has sparked something in you, clarity, curiosity, or a deeper sense of power, then don't stop here. Like, subscribe and share this video with someone else who's ready to rise above the noise and step into conscious creation. Because the world doesn't need more people choosing sides. It needs more people who can hold both and build something new. You are that person. Let's keep going.